It was a bright, bustling afternoon at an upscale department store in the heart of the city. Shoppers hurried around, their arms laden with bags, voices humming like a soft chorus of chaos. Among them was 16-year-old Naomi, a quiet yet confident black girl with deep brown eyes that held a spark of determination. She had come to the store to pick up a dress for her upcoming school event, her excitement bubbling beneath the surface. Little did she know, this simple trip would turn into an unforgettable moment, one that would change how everyone in that store saw her forever. As Naomi browsed the racks, she couldn't help but notice the sideways glances. A pair of store clerks whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward her with thinly veiled suspicion. Naomi tried to shake off the discomfort, focusing on the beautiful clothes in front of her, but the uneasy feeling clung to her like a shadow. She didn't want to assume the worst, but the tension in the air was undeniable. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into something more direct. A tall, middle-aged woman wearing a sharp blazer approached Naomi, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her name tag read manager, but her demeanor screamed something far less welcoming. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice cool and clipped. "Can I help you with something?" There was no warmth in her tone, only a cold, probing question that didn't feel like an offer of assistance. Naomi blinked, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. "Oh no, I'm just looking," she replied politely, her voice steady but soft. She held up a dress she had been admiring, hoping to show she was just another customer. But the manager's eyes narrowed, looking her. "Well, we had some incidents here recently. I'll need to stay where I can see you." The words hit Naomi like a slap, each one dripping with an unspoken accusation. Her heart sank and a hot flush of embarrassment crept up her neck as other shoppers began to notice the exchange. She felt their eyes on her, judging, assuming, condemning. Naomi wanted to defend herself, to shout that she had done nothing wrong. But the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. The humiliation was overwhelming, and for a moment, she thought about leaving the store altogether. Yet something inside her refused to let her walk away. This wasn't right, and she knew it. Just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the store. Naomi turned to see her father, Daniel, walking toward her. He was tall and commanding, with a calm but powerful presence that seemed to silence the room as he approached. Dressed in a crisp suit and carrying himself with quiet authority, he looked every bit like a man who was used to being listened to. Daniel's eyes scanned the scene, instantly taking in the way his daughter was standing, the flushed embarrassment on her face, and the smug expression of the manager. Without raising his voice, he asked Naomi, "What's going on?" Naomi hesitated, unsure of how to explain. But before she could answer, the manager stepped in, her tone still sharp. "Is this your father?" she asked, clearly unimpressed. "We've been having some issues with shoplifting. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order." Daniel's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in the air around him, an almost imperceptible ripple of power that made everyone stop and pay attention. He placed a protective hand on Naomi's shoulder and turned to the manager, his voice calm but firm. "Are you accusing my daughter of something?" The manager hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. "No, of course not," she stammered. "I was just doing my job." Daniel didn't break eye contact, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Your job," he said slowly, "is to treat every customer in this store with respect. Is that what you've done here?" The room fell silent, and the manager's face turned pale. Shoppers who had been pretending not to eavesdrop were now openly watching, their curiosity piqued by the quiet authority in Daniel's voice. Naomi stood beside her father, feeling a mixture of relief and awe. She had always known her dad was strong, but she was about to discover just how much power he truly held. And then, in a moment that would leave everyone in the store speechless, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out something that would change everything. The store grew eerily quiet as Daniel stood there, his hand dipping into his pocket. Every eye was on him, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure what her father was about to do, but she could feel the weight of his presence, the kind of calm authority that couldn't be ignored. The manager, clearly unsettled, shifted nervously. Her earlier confidence seemed to have evaporated in the face of Daniel's steady gaze. "Sir," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to offend Anyon." Daniel raised his hand slightly, cutting her off, though not rudely. His expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp, and it didn't leave hers. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice measured. "That's interesting, because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like my daughter was singled out for no good reason. I'd like to know why." Naomi's cheeks burned as she stood there, still clutching the dress she'd been admiring. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but the lump in her throat wouldn't go away. All she could do was stand there and watch as her father handled the situation, his calm demeanor masking a quiet intensity that was both reassuring and intimidating. The manager swallowed hard, her confidence continuing to waver. I was just doing my job," she said again, though the words sounded weaker this time. "We've had issues with theft recently, and I have to be cautious." "Cautious," Daniel repeated, nodding slowly. He glanced around the store, his gaze sweeping over the other shoppers who were still watching the scene unfold. "And out of all the people in this store, you decided my daughter looks suspicious. Why is that?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. The manager opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Naomi noticed her shifting uncomfortably, as though she were trying to come up with an excuse but couldn't find one that wouldn't make her look worse. Daniel didn't let up. "My daughter came here to shop, just like everyone else. She didn't do anything wrong. She didn't ask to be humiliated in front of all these people. And yet here we are." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "So again I'll ask, why her?" Naomi glanced around, noticing the way the other shoppers were reacting. Some looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as though they didn't want to be caught staring. Others seemed genuinely curious, leaning in to catch every word. A few even nodded slightly, as if silently agreeing with Daniel. The manager finally managed to find her voice, though it was shakier than before. "Sir, I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I just—" Daniel raised his hand again, stopping her mid-sentence. "Let me save you the trouble," he said, his tone still calm but laced with an edge that made it clear he wasn't in the mood for excuses. "You judged my daughter based on how she looks. Maybe you didn't mean to, but you did. And instead of treating her like a valued customer, you treated her like a problem." The words hit Naomi like a wave, and for a moment, she felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite sort through. Relief that her father was standing up for her, anger at the way she'd been treated, and a deep, aching sadness that this kind of thing still happened. Daniel reached into his pocket again, and this time he pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. Opening it, he retrieved a business card and held it out to the manager. She hesitated before taking it, her hands trembling slightly. Naomi couldn't see what was on the card, but she noticed the way the manager's eyes widened as she read it. Her face turned pale, and she quickly looked back up at Daniel, her expression a mix of shock and panic. "I think you'll find," Daniel said evenly, "that I'm someone who takes this kind of thing very seriously. I'm not just talking about how you treated my daughter. I'm talking about the culture in this store, the kind of culture that allows this to happen in the first place." The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Naomi could tell she was scrambling to come up with a response, but nothing she could say would make the situation any better. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, and Naomi found herself gripping the dress in her hands even tighter. She wanted to ask her dad what was on that card, but now didn't seem like the time. Instead, she stayed quiet, her eyes darting between him and the manager. Daniel took a step closer to the manager, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment feel even more intense. "You should know," he said, "that I'm not the kind of person who lets things like this slide. So I suggest you take a long, hard look at how you're running this store. Because the next time something like this happens, it won't end with a conversation." The manager nodded quickly, her face still pale. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." Daniel stepped back, his expression softening slightly as he turned to Naomi. "Are you ready to go, sweetheart?" he asked, his tone gentle now. Naomi nodded, unable to find her voice. She felt a strange mix of emotions, grateful for her father's support, but still shaken by what had happened. As they walked toward the exit, Naomi noticed the way people were looking at them. Some looked impressed, others ashamed, and a few simply curious. She even caught a glimpse of a young black woman near the back of the store who gave her a small, encouraging smile. Once they were outside, the cool air hit Naomi's face, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Dad," she said softly, finally finding her voice. "What was on that card you gave her?" Daniel glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just my name and title," he said simply. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And that's enough to make someone look like they'd seen a ghost." Her father chuckled softly. "Let's just say I have a little influence in certain circles." Naomi frowned, still confused, but decided not to push the issue. She knew her dad was a successful businessman, but she hadn't realized just how much weight his name carried. As they walked to the car, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Whatever her father's influence was, it clearly went beyond what she had imagined. And as much as she wanted to put the whole humiliating experience behind her, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Little did she know the events of that day were only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would leave an impact far beyond the walls of that department store. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Naomi leaned back in her seat, watching the city blur past the window. She tried to push the events of the store out of her mind, but the embarrassment and anger lingered, swirling in her chest like a storm she couldn't escape. The way the manager had looked at her, spoken to her, it wasn't something she could easily forget. Her father drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't say anything for a while, but Naomi could feel his eyes on her occasionally, as if he was checking to see if she was okay. Finally, he broke the silence. "I know that wasn't easy for you," he said softly. Naomi turned to look at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. "It's not the first time something like that has happened," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it was worse this time." Everyone was staring. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so slightly, his jaw clenching for a moment before he spoke. "You shouldn't have to deal with things like that," he said firmly. "And I'll make sure that manager learns her lesson." Naomi frowned, curiosity tugging at her. "What did you mean back there? About not letting things slide?" Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes people need to be reminded that their actions have consequences," he said simply. "That's all." Naomi wanted to press him for more details, but there was something in his tone that made her hold back. She wasn't sure if it was because he didn't want to talk about it or because he didn't think she needed to know. Either way, she let the subject drop, for now. When they got home, Naomi went straight to her room, closing the door behind her. She tossed the dress onto her bed and sat down beside it, staring at the fabric. It was beautiful, just like she'd imagined, but the joy of finding it had been completely overshadowed by everything that had happened. She picked up her phone, scrolling through her messages to distract herself. A few of her friends had texted her about the school event, asking if she found something to wear. Naomi hesitated for a moment before typing out a quick response. "Yeah, I found a dress. It's nice." She didn't mention anything about the store or what had happened. It wasn't something she wanted to relive. But as she sat there, her mind kept drifting back to the look on her father's face when he handed the manager that card. There was something about it, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. He'd always been protective of her, but this felt different. It was like he'd been holding back, like there was more he wanted to say or do but didn't. The next morning, Naomi woke up to the sound of her father talking on the phone downstairs. His voice was calm but firm, the same tone he used with the manager. She couldn't make out the words, but the conversation sounded important. Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept down the stairs, staying out of sight as she listened. "I don't care what their policies are," Daniel was saying. "What happened yesterday was unacceptable. I want a formal apology, not just to my daughter, but to every customer who's ever been treated like that in your store." He paused, listening to the person on the other end. "No, I'm not interested in excuses. Fix it." Naomi's heart raced as she listened. She wasn't sure who he was talking to, but it was clear he wasn't letting this go. She felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude for his support, but also a growing sense of unease. She didn't want to be the center of attention, especially not in a situation like this. When Daniel hung up, Naomi stepped into the kitchen, pretending she hadn't been eavesdropping. "Morning," she said casually, grabbing a glass of water. Daniel looked up, giving her a small smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay?" Naomi shrugged. "I guess. Who were you talking to just now?" Her father hesitated for a moment, then said, "Someone from the store's corporate office. I wanted to make sure they understand what happened yesterday and take steps to prevent it from happening again." Naomi frowned, setting down her glass. "You don't have to do all that, Dad. It's not like they're going to change just because of one complaint." Daniel crossed the room, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're probably right," he said, "but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try. People like that manager count on the fact that most of the time, no one will call them out. They think they can get away with treating people however they want, but not this time." Naomi sighed, leaning against the counter. "I just don't want it to turn into a big deal. I don't want everyone talking about me." Daniel gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'm not doing this to draw attention to you. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." She nodded, but the unease didn't completely go away. As much as she appreciated her father's support, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than either of them realized. Later that day, Naomi decided to meet up with her best friend, Alyssa, to take her mind off things. They went to a small cafe near their school, sitting at their usual table by the window. "You okay?" Alyssa asked, stirring her iced coffee. You seem kind of distracted. Naomi hesitated, debating whether to tell their friend about what had happened. Finally, she said, something happened at the store yesterday. The manager accused me of stealing. Alyssa's eyes widened. What? Are you serious? That's so messed up. Naomi nodded, fiddling with the straw in her drink. Yeah, and my dad stepped in. He kind of made a scene. Alyssa frowned. Good. Someone needed to. People can't just get away with stuff like that. I know, Naomi said. But now he's making calls and trying to get the corporate office involved. It's just a lot. Alyssa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. I mean, I get why you'd feel weird about it. But honestly, your dad sounds like a total boss. I wish my parents would stand up for me like that. Naomi smiled faintly, but her mind was still racing. As much as she wanted to believe everything would blow over, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. And she was right. Unbeknownst to Naomi, the store incident had already started to ripple out into the wider world. Conversations were happening in boardrooms and offices. Decisions were being made, and soon the consequences of that one encounter would become impossible to ignore.